Good morning, everyone, and good evening to those joining us from China. Thank you for being with us for our webinar, Canada-China Agri-Food Update 2026, Market Access, Trade Outlook, and the Evolving Supply Chain. Before we begin, just a quick note that today's session is being recorded and will be shared after the event. We're pleased to bring together a panel of experts based in Canada and China, offering on-the-ground perspectives across policy, trade, and commercial engagement in the agri-food sector. My name is Lotta Igartua. I am the Regional Director, Western Canada at the Canada-China Business Council, also known as CCBC. I'd like to begin by acknowledging that our BC chapter is based in Vancouver on the traditional, ancestral, and unceded territories of the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh nations. For those who may be less familiar with CCBC, we are a bilateral, non-profit, membership-based organization that has been supporting Canadian companies in China and Chinese companies in Canada for nearly 50 years. We work closely with members across sectors to support market access, provide on-the-ground insights, and facilitate dialogue between business and government. So last year, CCBC hosted our inaugural agri-food mission to China, and we're planning on hosting a second one later this year. These missions are about reinforcing Canada's commitment to China and building stronger relationships and helping exporters tap into new opportunities. So today's discussion comes at an important time. We're seeing signs of stabilization in Canada-China trade alongside a more active phase of engagement. And recent visits to China by Prime Minister Carney, Minister Champagne, Minister Sido underscore renewed momentum at the government level. And at the same time, evolving market access condition, regulatory frameworks, and buyer expectations are shaping how Canadian companies operate and compete in the China market. So we're very pleased to have a strong group of speakers joining us today that will bring perspectives from across industry and on-the-ground experience in China. I'll introduce them more in detail shortly before the panel. So before we move to the discussion, I'd like to invite our sponsor to provide opening remark. Saskatchewan has been very active in engaging with China, particularly in the agri-food sector, and we're very grateful for their support of today's webinar. It's now my pleasure to introduce Ryan Cossett, Assistant Deputy Minister, International Engagement from the Government of Saskatchewan.
Thanks, Lotta. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening to all our guests. Again, I'm Ryan Cossett, the Assistant Deputy Minister of our International Engagement Division at the Ministry of Trade and Export Development for the Government of Saskatchewan. Very pleased to be here on behalf of Saskatchewan and to participate in this morning's event. Thank you to the Canada-China Business Council, of course, to Lotta in particular and her team, and again for inviting me and the rest of us from my team to be part of today's session. Clearly, the agri-food sector is very near and dear to Saskatchewan's economy. So we're quite grateful for the chance to be here to talk about it and join these esteemed guests today and talk a little bit about the context of how important it is in terms of our international trade relationship and, of course, especially with China. As I'm sure you're all aware, Canada and China recently made some strong progress on our trade relationship. We're quite pleased by that. This was thanks to a lot of the work from all sides, from Saskatchewan, from Canada, and of course China, along with partners like the CCBC. And as we've already heard, instrumental to at least two premier missions, among others, and the CCBC was a big part of that. So the government of Saskatchewan, very proud of the role that we played in the current Canada-China trade agreement. China is Saskatchewan's second largest trading partner, as some of you will know, and our exports to that country totaled over $2.9 billion in 2025. Many of our exports, of course, are in agri-food, important commodities like canola, like wheat, like potash, but of course, pork and beef as well, which supports security for food around the globe. We've seen some tremendous momentum over the past months. As I mentioned, in September, Premier Mo traveled to China to meet with Chinese counterparts and stakeholders. That visit was extremely important, and it helped to set the table for what was some necessary federal government engagements, particularly by the Canadian government. And that was the first visit by a Canadian premier in almost 6 years. That visit was strongly supported by our valued partners, including CCBC, and we are very grateful to them. So thanks to CCBC for their efforts to not only make that mission a success, but for supporting Saskatchewan and Canadian interests in China. We're also proud of Saskatchewan's China Trade and Investment Office and the work that it has played in recent months and years. We have been working in China for over a decade and certainly value the relationships that we've been able to build during that time, in part through partnerships like the one we have here with CCBC. I'd mentioned another mission of recent, and of course, this past January, Premier Mo returned with Prime Minister Carney and made significant headway on some tariff issues. So we were, of course, very pleased to see the reduction in tariffs that began this past March. We've seen, as a result, some substantial orders come in under the 14.9% tariff rate for canola seed in particular, which we're encouraged by. This is obviously of great benefit to both Canadian producers and Chinese buyers, but we know there is a lot more work to do. Our government will continue to work with officials and stakeholders in China to keep the dialogue open and hopefully for the benefit of both of our countries. This is crucial as we continue to improve market access and to try to minimize tariffs as much as possible on Saskatchewan exports. So we have a lot to offer, and partnerships like ours with CCBC make us more effective both here in Saskatchewan and across Canada, which is precisely why important opportunities like today's seminar are so valued and important to us. So I suspect that our dialogue today will address some of the opportunities for further cooperation and hopefully chart some new pathways for even more success in China. I will say, unfortunately, I cannot remain on the entire call this morning, but I rest assured my team is here and you are capably able to engage with Saskatchewan during today's session, despite my departure. But I very much look forward to hearing about the learning opportunities that come about today and how that's going to benefit both Saskatchewan and China. So once again, thank you very much for the invitation for me to speak here today. Thank you to the Canadian-China Business Council for today's event, and I wish you all the very best of success today and in the future. Thank you.
Thank you, Assistant Deputy Minister, and thank you also for sharing what the province is doing and how you're developing your relations in China. So now it's my pleasure to introduce you to our panelists. Their full biographies can be found in the online event listing, but I'll mention them again in order of in how they are listed on our event image. We are very pleased to have Chris Davison, President and CEO of the Canola Council of Canada. We have David Perret de Rosier, our Director in our Beijing office from the Canada-China Business Council. We have Christopher White, President and CEO of the Canadian Meat Advocacy Office, CMAO, and Canada Pork. And Chris was our chair at the last year's Agri-Food mission. And we also have Cynthia Xing, Managing Director and Head of Greater China Public and Government Affairs at Edelman PR Worldwide. So it's my pleasure to have you all joining. Most of our panelists are joining in from China, and I'm very grateful for them dialing in and staying up late to join the conversation today. We really appreciate that. So to start us off, we've seen signs of stabilization in Canada-China trade. And from your perspective, it would be great to hear what has changed most in the agri-food relationship, whether it will be market access, regulatory engagement, or commercial activity. David, would you like to start us off and maybe have some macro views over this?
Sure. Well, first of all, thank you, Lotta, and it's a great pleasure to be part of this discussion. I think it's a very important discussion to have. Allow me maybe to share some of the perspectives that we had here at CCBC in Beijing, but also in Greater China. And allow me maybe to go back to 2024, more precisely in November 2024, when former Minister Macaulay visited China. And at the time, he was the Minister of Agriculture and Agri-Food. And that was a very important visit, I would say. And we all know what happened in 2025 in terms of tariffs that were retaliation to the tariffs imposed by Canada on Chinese EVs. But what we noticed right after the visit of Minister Macaulay is that some channels started to reopen in terms of engagement for us at the Business Council, but also for different stakeholders. And those channels were with different leaders from the agri-food industry here in China, at the government level as well as the commercial level. And it really enabled discussions to restart or at least reactivate. And if we look towards 2025, we all know what happened with the tariffs. And then when Mark Carney became Prime Minister of Canada, on the ground, there was a constant, I would say, re-engagement that we observed at the working level through, it was mentioned earlier, Premier Mo coming with also Parliament Secretary and other ministerial visits as well, and deputy minister level visits. And we also saw a momentum building up in terms of industry re-engagement. And I think Chris White will be able to talk about it. But when we saw the Canadian Meat Advocacy Office opening last year in Beijing, it was a step also that reflected the re-engagement. And Chris Davidson, we saw him visiting China on multiple occasions, and many other stakeholders. And we believe that we've been busier in 2025, and we believe that those discussions really led to all the announcements that were made in January during the visit of Prime Minister Carney. And often, this is not at the forefront, but this is extremely important in advancing, mutual understanding, advancing key files. And yes, there's still outstanding issues or trade irritants in terms of tariffs that are still there. But, I think we're quite encouraged by the momentum that is being carried. Minister Champagne visited, Minister Sidhu as well. Canada was the guest country of honor to CICPE, which stands for China International Consumer Product Expo, which is something that was not necessarily likely a year ago, even 2 years ago. So we see significant progress. And what is the most encouraging is not only we're way busier than in 2025 here in China as CCBC representatives to different engagement, and we're extremely pleased by that. But also what is extremely encouraging is that many industry representatives and leaders are often part of those discussions, and we're extremely appreciative of those channels being available as well. And that's right on both sides, right? Both in Canada as well as both in China. And I think it's important to keep those discussions going, because with the most recent 5-year plan, and we'll be able to discuss a little bit more about this, there's going to be significant policy changes. And those policy changes will affect exporters of agri-food products, right? In terms of how your exports will be integrated into services for, supply chain transparency and many other important part of what makes a bilateral trade relationship. And I'm sure Cynthia will be able to provide more details on that later as well. So I would say, looking ahead, 2026 is going to be a crucial year to maintain those engagements. It's going to be also a crucial year, to take advantage of the multiple platforms, and I'll be glad to share some of them, but also leverage multilateral platforms such as APEC, which will provide multiple opportunities for engagement, in order to solve the trade irritants, in order to build mutual understanding. And, the progress has been done quite rapidly when we look at other countries that were in a similar situation a few years ago. But, what we constantly advocate for, it's important to also to maintain that pace of engagement and maintain that constant showing up, right? We often say, you can fake caring, but you cannot fake showing up. And we're glad to see many people coming to China. But maybe many of you saw that the Prime Minister of Spain was in Beijing a few days ago. Everyone is coming to China. It's a very competitive market. And in order to take advantage of all the policy changes, in order to stay on top of everything that is happening, that's going to be very important. So I will wrap up here, and I'll be glad to maybe provide more details later in the discussion.
Great. Thank you, David. Thank you. That's great to hear about the momentum and also very encouraging. If we could look at some more sector specific, maybe Chris White would like to talk a little bit more about the meat industry.
Thanks, Lotta. I'd say a couple things, just sort of picking up on David's point. It's an incredibly competitive market over here, and industry has to be and have to be their own best advocates. If you look at the beginning of the year when the Prime Minister came, by the time Trump comes next month, 6 of the 7 G7 world leaders will have been through Beijing. So far this year, there's been 23 world leaders through Beijing. This week, there's been the Prime Minister of Spain, the new Prime Minister of Vietnam, the Foreign Minister of Russia is here this week, and the Emir or Sheikh from the UAE has also been here this week. And that's just this week. And what's really fascinating when you actually are living on the ground in Beijing is it's a turnstile, right? Much like you'll see when people go to lobby officials in Ottawa, but it is at the highest level. So, the reset that the Prime Minister and the government has done has been really, really significant. But I would say that what is really important from our sector, but I think just more broadly speaking in the ag sector, is you really need to be here. And it's not just a one and done, as you sometimes see in Ottawa, right? People will do a lobby day and then the minister's office doesn't see them for another 364 days. You can almost get away with that in Ottawa, not really, but you can to a degree. You can't here because everything is predicated on that very slow, that very incremental, and it's the trust, right? And the other piece is when we look at our sector, it took us 5 years to get beef restored. We were suspended in 2021, and we didn't get access again until 3 months ago. We have a 25% tariff still outstanding on pork. So, what's really struck me in the years that I've been coming to China over the last decade is if it is not industry advocating for their own sector, as good as our officials are at the embassy and at the consulates, they have such a broad suite of responsibilities that the opportunities they have to speak on our behalf is really, really, I don't want to say insignificant, but our issues don't come up that often, right? In the pantheon of everything else they're talking about. So if we're not here, if I'm not here talking about red meat, if I'm not here talking about the tariff, there's nobody, frankly, talking about that. And one of the things that's really critical in my experience with talking with Chinese officials for the last decade is they need to understand why it's important. They need to understand what you are doing vis-a-vis your own government to try and find a solution. I would also say 2 other points, and I'll turn it back to you, Lotta. When you look at some of the changes that have recently taken place in Ottawa, right? You've got a new Deputy Minister of International Trade, new Deputy Minister of Global Affairs. The Canadian ambassador is rotating out quite soon. And within the embassy, 3, maybe 4, if I'm not mistaken, of the ag team are rotating out this summer. So there's a lot of turnover just in both Ottawa and Beijing. And then when you look at some of the recent cuts to the federal public service, every consulate and the embassy in Beijing has been affected. So again, right, they got such a broad set of responsibilities at the embassy level, at the consulate level, and at the officials level in Ottawa that it really is critical. And the reason we set up a red meat advocacy office in Beijing is to ensure that we have that day-to-day contact with officials. We're talking to other embassies, we're talking to other Chinese trade associations, and we're just kind of here, right? Just slow and steady, because as I say, if we're not here, as good as it is to have the Prime Minister and Champagne and Sea-Doo and Premier Mo, our issue is, this much if we're lucky. Realistically, that's even being optimistic. So I would just encourage anybody who does have trade issues in China, partner with CCBC. They're a terrific resource. David and Lotta and the rest of the team in Shanghai and other parts, they do a phenomenal job for industries. They've got wonderful relationships, not just with the Chinese government, but the Canadian government. And it's a really, if you've not had a lot of experience in China, it's a great way to slowly acclimatize yourself to the cadence and who you have to talk to in China. You want to obviously build up your own reputation in terms of what's going on in your sector and industry, but it's a really big jump to go from nothing into a really challenging market such as China. So you're looking for that interlocutor, and think of it somewhat analogous to a trade or a government relations firm in Ottawa that you need to help shepherd you around Ottawa for the first little while. But I cannot impress upon you enough how complex this environment is, how challenging this environment is, how competitive it is. So you need to be here. And if you're not here, again, your issues may get a little bit of airtime, but with everything else our officials are dealing with, they're not going to get a lot of airtime. And then if they're not, they begin to recede. And the very last point I would say is what's often been shared with me on the part of Chinese officials is if we don't see you or hear from you, then we don't think your issue is important. So you want to maintain that momentum and just continue to remind them that it is important and that the Chinese market is important for your sector. And that's why I'm here. And that's why you'll see me again in 4 months. And that's why you'll see me again in 8 months, because I want to build this relationship and I want to help you on the Chinese side find a way to ensure that our product continues to come in. I'll leave it at that, Lot. I think that kind of captures my opening remarks. Thank you.
Great. Thank you for that, Chris. And also thank you for the plug about CCBC. I would like to hear a little bit more from the canola perspective. Chris Davison, do you have something to share about the changes broadly in the agri-food relationship from your sector?
Yeah, thanks, Lotta. Thanks, CCBC, for the opportunity. I'll maybe start by just picking up where Chris left off. The reason we're having this conversation and we're all here is because of the value and importance that the Canadian agri-food sector writ large attaches to the Chinese market and our Chinese customers. And certainly, for those who aren't familiar, and you heard Ryan talk about it earlier, from a canola perspective, that's massive. It's our second largest export market by value, just shy of $5 billion in 2024. But we saw a fairly precipitous drop in 2025 to less than half that. And so where does that leave us? I think that's kind of what your question is in terms of recent developments. And I'm pleased to say that, we're in a better place today than we were even a few short weeks ago. We received a much needed shot in the arm. I think an important measure of optimism as we head into, in the case of canola, we're just weeks away now from 2026 production starting. The preliminary agreement in principle that was announced on January 16th and started implementation on March 1st is really important. It demonstrates significant progress in the relationship. It provides us with a measure of predictability and stability. But I'll sort of pick up on what a few of the other speakers have already said so far. It's really a platform on which we have to build moving forward. How do we pursue more comprehensive, more enduring competitiveness, as you've heard a few times already, in the Chinese market? And so we really see this as an opportunity, a platform to build on that moving forward. We have some time-bound initiatives that are represented in that agreement, but we're all looking for more sort of comprehensive, more enduring competitiveness to meet the needs of China and Chinese customers. So, in the case of canola, it was definitely a market access issue, if you want to call it to that, and certainly prior to the agreement and its implementation, we'd effectively been shut out of this market as a result of two sets of tariffs. So we're very pleased to see the progress that's been realized, and it is significant progress, but it's a platform that we need to continue to use and build on moving forward. So I'll start with that and look forward to the rest of the discussion. Thanks very much.
Thank you, Chris. And then Cynthia, it would be great to hear from you from a more overall, because I know overall perspective. I know that you work with various clients across the agri-food space and also different countries as well.
Thanks, Lotta. Thank you for having me. And it's a great honor to join with a bunch of my friends to talk about this topic. As both Chris already mentioned and David mentioned, I just want to highlight three things here. The first one is being here is very important, but I want to highlight the importance of institutional trust, because we are, as Chris White already mentioned, that it is not just because the Prime Minister was here or we're having a very, very high level meetings or headlines. Is our job on the ground day in and day out. So that's how we make the trust goes beyond the government, beyond the industry, and among everyone. So that's the first thing I want to highlight based on all of our colleagues' points. The second one would be, I think it is very important to highlight the value of coordinated advocacy efforts at both governments. Because Chris White was here, Chris Davidson visited China already twice this year. We are only in early April. That's also very, very important, but we have to remind that they paid great several times of visit to the Chinese embassy in Ottawa as well, and a lot of other business leaders are here to visit government agencies, value chains. So I think the coordinated efforts behind the scene are very important as well. The third thing is I want to mention, all of you mentioned that China is a very important market for Canadian agri-food sectors. And China is benchmarking globally, not just bilaterally. So China is working with US, with Brazil, with Australia, everyone. So as Chris White mentioned, it is very important to let the Chinese government stakeholders to understand what's at stake. In the Chinese saying, we say the loudest crying babies have the most attention. So I guess that's the situation. But I think it is very important to bear in mind that Canada is in a much better position than a couple of weeks ago, as Chris Davidson mentioned, but we are not back to business as usual yet. So I think the important question for us to continue this conversation would be, the fact of trade has been stabilized does not mean we are back to business as usual. And the key question in front of all of us would be how we turn this period of stabilized and renewed trade into the long-term and loyalty of trade partnerships. So I want to just build on my colleague's point here to begin the conversation.
Great. Thank you. Thank you so much for that, Cynthia. I know we touched on it a little bit already, but it would be great to do a bit of a sector dive and look at the market access and policy. So I'd like to draw on Chris White and Chris Davidson's experiences. So turning first to the meat sector, Chris White, would you be able to give like just briefly like a little snapshot of kind of like the market access for Canadian products, meat products? I know that you mentioned new renewed access for beef, and then also if we can. What do you think made the difference in regaining this access, and how can we ensure that progress is sustained?
Well, with respect to beef, it was, I think, it was a sort of incremental build, right? I mean, when Minister Macaulay came, he didn't get a lot of high-level meetings, but he still came, right? And that's the signal. Chinese officials want to know if you're going to come when it's not easy to come. Because that is showing the commitment to the market. So certainly having the Prime Minister come, Mr. MacDonald, come when he did with the Prime Minister was very helpful. He'd been here in the fall, which was very helpful as well. He met his counterpart. So, I think we've all sort of alluded to it, Cynthia, Chris, David, and myself. It's that sustained presence, right? Over time, excuse me. But it's also important to make sure that Chinese officials at the embassy in Ottawa have a good understanding of what you're trying to do. And certainly, my experience over the last number of years has been that they're open to meeting as long as you give them the clear understanding as to what you're trying to do and why, and etc. So from the red meat perspective, I would say, Lotta, frankly, it was the work of the minister, the Prime Minister's visit for sure. And I would say industry has done a really good job in terms of just consistently being here, over the last number of years. And certainly, from the time we were suspended 5 years ago, when I would be in China, and I've been in China close to 20 times over the last, 7 or 8 years, my point to the Chinese officials always was, you're going to let us back in. You want our product because it's world class. You want our product more specifically and more fundamentally, I would argue, because it is underpinned by world-class science. And the work that CFIA does, as frustrating as CFIA can be at times, if it were not for CFIA, we would have such limited global market access. And, food security in China, like it is in every country, is a really significant part of the equation. So when you can confirm or assure officials in any country, steady supply, high quality, and underpinned by world-class science makes a huge difference. Very quickly on the pork side, obviously we are struggling, because of the pork tariff, which has been in since March of 25, and it's not clear what that off ramp looks like. It was not tied to EVs; that was canola. Our commodity seems to be more tied to steel and aluminum, so that's a whole other challenge in and of itself. But the other piece, and I'll conclude on this, lot, is China right now has a very strong domestic pork production in and of itself, right? So what they import globally is continuing to diminish over the last number of years as their domestic producers scale up and have more capacity and more ability. So I think what we will see over time is as the demographic shift in China, right? You've got about 450, 500 million middle class right now. In the next 10 or 15 years, that will come close to doubling. So a lot of what Canada exports will probably begin to diminish, right? But it's a really significant market for industry. But it's, as we've all alluded to, it's a really competitive market. And so, at a very high level, it's great that beef is back in and we have to build up our profile. And I would say what's really interesting about the office that we opened about a year ago now is the Brazilians, and I think this is quite illustrative. The Brazilians have about a 65% market share on beef into China. They just opened an advocacy office about 4 months ago, sort of modeling after what we did. So in a world where a country like Brazil, who has such a stranglehold on the beef market in China, are opening up an advocacy office, that I think gives everybody a perspective or a sense of how critical it is that you and we have an ag office or an industry office focused on ag issues for Canada. I'll leave it at that, Lotta. Thank you.
Thank you for that, Chris. And yeah, and yeah, very great to hear about the advocacy and the importance of being on the ground. I know that you're working very closely with David and the team in Beijing as well to continue in developing the sector there. So it's great to have that collaboration together. From a canola perspective, I wanted to hear a little bit about like recent trade and policy developments and how that has changed the canola exports. And if there's anything you can share about like outlooks or contracts and trade flows in this year.
Yeah, thanks, Lotta. So maybe just to start by picking up where I left off before, we've had the Chinese market recently reopened after effectively being shut out by the two sets of tariffs. The one set as a result of the anti-discrimination investigation that saw tariffs on Canadian canola meal and oil. And then, of course, the tariffs that were in place as a result of the anti-dumping investigation into imports of Canadian canola seed. And we had a final determination on that not that long ago. And so movements on both of those fronts have reopened the market. They make us more competitive in this important and valued Chinese market again. Not ultimately where we want to be, but certainly, as I've said, a much better position than we were not long ago. And so I reiterate the point that it gives us a platform to build off, and we've got to continue the work to keep us more and more competitive, as some of my colleagues have said as well. So look, we've seen an immediate sort of shorter term response to that, as you're asking from the market in terms of vessels in ports like Vancouver. So that is encouraging. I don't think all the numbers have showed up in the statistics yet. Something I was just reading last night from the Canadian Grain Commission, it showed about just over 114,000 tons of canola exported to China during February. Of course, that's before the preliminary agreement in principle came into effect in March. And cumulative exports for the year up until that point were obviously significantly less because we were still dealing with those two sets of tariffs. But we know in terms of what there is in terms of that short immediate term response in terms of vessel lineups coming forward. So that is encouraging. But I would also say maybe in a different way than what we've also been saying, the market is dynamic. It is not static. It adapts and adjusts to a number of factors. If I go back and look at sort of the last 12 plus months, we had the situation before the movement on the tariffs that I just talked about. We then had a 2025 where we had record canola production in Canada, and we didn't have an outlet for that through our second largest market at the time. We also had strong canola and oilseed production in other jurisdictions and geographies around the world. And now all of us are also dealing with the war in Iran and its impacts as well. So I just mentioned that to sort of say that the market is never static. It doesn't just respond and process this one positive development. It's constantly adjusting positively or negatively to other things that are happening. So, which is really just shorthand for saying that we can't rest on our laurels, right? We need to keep adapting ourselves. We've gained a period of some measure of predictability and stability, but at the risk of repeating myself, we need to build off of that and that momentum and continue advancing our collective competitiveness. So very positive, good short-term response. The market is dynamic. We need to not rest on our laurels. We're seeing it in other ways too. You know, both public and private estimates for canola seeding in 2026 are very positive. That's not, we expect probably a slight increase in acres for 2026. That's not solely attributable to progress here in China, but it's certainly supported by the progress here. So we're encouraged by that as well. So if you look both from a production, there's a long ways to go. Mother Nature and a number of other things are going to weigh in over the next several months. But we have that front on the front end of production. We have the movement on the tariffs that has made us more competitive in the market again. But again, the market will continue to do what the market does, and we need to continue our efforts collectively to ensure Canadian agri-food products are competitive in China.
Great. Thank you very much for that overview and talking through the dynamics of the market, etc. It's never standing still. It always keeps on changing for sure. So moving on to the next question, and I wanted to tap into Edelman for this to start with on this one. So during the period of reduced engagement, how did companies prepare for re-entry to China during this time? Were there specific strategies, maybe diversification, government engagement, relationship building? What was the most efficient? Cynthia, would you like to share?
Right, thanks, Lotte. I think Edelman has been doing our annual trust barometer reports for 26 years, and our latest report confirms again one thing: trust is not built in the good times; it's proven in difficult ones. So, what we've been seeing working with the global business, what's really set companies or industries apart during the slow period was their commitment to remain engaged and relevant, not just walking away. So, Canadian companies and the industries should maintain meaningful engagement to consider re-entry into China. And I want to highlight three things we've been seeing over and over and constantly stood out. The first thing would be diversification does not mean leaving the Chinese market. We've already talked about a lot how important China is, but the top exporters manage risk by developing alternative markets for sure. But they intentionally maintaining strong constructive relationship with the Chinese stakeholders. The meaningful engagement went way beyond occasional phone calls to regular in-person visits. And Chris, you just mentioned that you just moved to Beijing, so welcome again. All of these efforts developed a really deepened the mutual understanding and trust. When the situation improved, that's why we see how smoothly the trade picked up and those companies resumed the business operations, moving far beyond transactional deals. The second one would be building institutional trust for resilience. The most resilient organization we've seen was those remained visibly committed, engaging not only with the Chinese policymakers, but also with the industry associations and the value chain partners. Maintaining this kind of institutional engagement, especially during the challenging times, demonstrated stability and continuity, which is very important to sustain robust and long-term partnerships. And in my opinion, I do think business should proactively shape the trade environment rather than wait for changes. This is how you influence both the industry sentiment and business outcome. The last thing I want to highlight here would be delivering value beyond the products. Many of the industries and companies use this slow period to strengthen their overall value proposition for China. What this means is aligning their offerings with China's evolving strategic priorities. For example, in the 15th five-year plan, China highlighted supply chain reliability, downstream utilization, competitiveness, and sustainability. This all can help you to position yourself not just as a suppliers, but also as an essential partners to help work with the Chinese partners to address their broader challenges. So that's where I think three actions could help the Canadian industry or to think about how they develop their strategy to re-enter China. Thanks, Lotta.
Thank you very much, Cynthia. I also wanted to check in on the canola sector in terms of like how to prepare during the downturn. So obviously Saskatchewan being the biggest producer of canola and the province being very active in China, it would be great to hear your views on this as well.
Yeah, thanks, Lotta. And I want to pick up with one of the things that Cynthia just mentioned, because she started with diversification, and there's a lot of talk about diversification these days, and rightly so. But a couple of things to point out about that. Everyone is pursuing diversification at the same time. It's not just us or just one or two other countries or markets. I mean, everybody is doing that for, I think, pretty obvious reasons. Secondly, though, I want to say, when we talk about diversification, we talk about it in terms of complementarity, not substitutability. And I think that's a point that Cynthia also made. It's not about replacing a market. We're in the markets we're in for very good reasons. And so I think that really just reemphasizes the importance that we need to do everything we can to make sure that the existing markets are functioning as well as possible, which is why we're here having this conversation and putting so much emphasis in this case on the Chinese market. And I think that's really, really important. We need our most important markets to function as effectively as possible. And yes, we can look for complementary market opportunities. That's expected of us. That's logical. That's rational. But again, it's complementarity, not substitutability. In terms of other things that have been done, they've been sort of said in different ways. It was really important that we maintained presence and visibility as we work through the issues that we inevitably face together. People have already said it in different ways, but it's arguably more important to be present and visible when times are tough than when times are good. And so I don't think that's lost on any of us, and was a key part and needs to remain a key part of our work and efforts going forward. Obviously, there was a lot of work in China and market, but there was a lot of work going on domestically in Canada as well to pursue a resolution to these issues, and that work continues. That involves informing, it involves updating, it involves educating, it involves highlighting the impact, in our case, from the farm gate right through the value chain to export and to processing of the issues that we were facing in this case with China. And that requires high level and frequent engagement. And it was very clear and made very clear to us from our members and others that reestablishing market access was the number one priority in that regard. So that's what drove our activities. But there's also been a couple of reference to or allusions to the importance of other voices. And Lotta, I think you mentioned it in this case, the provincial governments and the sponsor today, along with you folks, the government of Saskatchewan. You're correct, Saskatchewan's the largest canola producer. About 55% of all Canadian production comes from the province of Saskatchewan, and also houses the majority of processing as well. So very important that voices outside of, obviously, in addition to the federal government, in addition to us as industry, but that there are other voices, and the provincial governments were extremely important in that regard. You know, historically, if we kind of look at market access issues, we have different roles for government and industry, but sometimes they're not always clear cut. You know, historically, from an industry perspective, there'd be more focus on things like market promotion and prioritizing opportunities and execution, and you would look to government for infrastructure infrastructure to support markets and support international market access and foster innovation. Those are all true, but not all issues fall neatly into those camps. And we were very clear from the outset of this particular set of issues that we were dealing with. It was ultimately a political issue that was going to require a political response and a resolution. And so how do we all come together to advance that? And I was very pleased to see how that was done through the variety of participants and stakeholders that we've talked about. And I think there's some good lessons learned there for us moving forward as well. Thanks.
Thank you. Thank you very much for that. So the idea of maintaining relationships is a great segue into the next questions about what's happening on the ground today in China. So from an on-the-ground perspective, what are you seeing in China today in terms of buyer behavior, demand, and engagement with Canadian companies? Perhaps Cynthia would like to start with this question.
Sure. Thanks, Lotta. I think from a practical standpoint, what we are seeing on the ground today is that China continues to be one of the few markets capable of importing significant volume of premium Canadian agri-food products. I want to share some latest data. In the first quarter, China's GDP grew 5% year on year, and the total imports increased 19.6% year on year. That's remarkable for this year. And of course, Canadian contribute a lot. But as I said, Canadian agri-food sectors has a very strong presence in China, and Chris also mentioned that the sector is already recognized for its steady supply, exceptional quality and safety standards, and reputation as a reliable partner. And this foundation of trust really helped us survive the recent challenges we've all seen in 2025. However, I also keep thinking that what we all seen on the other side would be how quickly political interests and geopolitical tensions could disrupt global supply chain and trade. Risk for us is no longer a one-time factor. It is a constant. China has also come to the understanding that even with the most robust trade relationship, they're not enough on its own. So the bar for long-term success has become much higher. So in my opinion, I think food security and competitiveness are very important strategic priorities for China, and also what Canadian industry should take into consideration to align your strengths to build long-term institutional trust. I will share a little bit more about those 2 points. In terms of food security, as Chris Davidson just mentioned, everyone is doing diversification. So it's not a unique thing for Canada or China. And China's buyers now, of course, have plenty of options. But having more suppliers does not automatically mean there are equal preference for each. Quality and reliability are still the deciding factors. The lower cost suppliers may have entered the market quickly, but rapid access does not guarantee trust for sure. So Chinese buyers are carefully evaluating their trade-offs. Quality consistency, food safety, logistics, and profit margins. So for Canadian exporters, it is much easier for you to uphold your established trust compared with those new entrants to build it from scratch. The second one would be competitiveness. I think it's very important to highlight here would be simply what we've seen on the ground is having market access does not mean trade. Having trade does not mean preference or loyalty. So the playing field has changed, and Canada now is competing with others on 3 critical fronts. First one, geopolitical dynamics. They're increasingly influence trade and investment environments, especially when global supply chain security become a major concern. Political negotiations and deals are the biggest trade variables. As Chris White mentioned earlier, that President Trump is planning his trip to China, and everyone is speculating which kind of agriculture imports deal he will make. So that's the biggest thing in today's environment. Risk management and institutional trust are the foundation for sustained business operations. The second one would be Chinese buyers are benchmarking globally, not just bilaterally. As we already discussed, is about complementary, not substitution. Canada is competing not only just on your quality, product qualities and reputation, but also your total value. Whether you have reliable supply, the joint research, and willingness to collaborate and grow together. The last one would be the long-term positioning is crucial. I think the strategic objective here for us is not just to restore our export volumes. It is to rebuild confidence, preference, and institutional trust. So you can be seen as the reliable partner and better protect against the future disruptions. But eventually, I just want to summarize my point here is the quality and the depth of the relationship is the most important value for you to navigating uncertainties and achieve long-term success, business success in China. So that would be my 2 cents. Lotta?
Thank you, Cynthia. So it's not only about access, it's also about how you show up in the market. So moving on to the next question. We're hearing that agri-food trade is becoming more complex and service heavy, so including traceability, compliance, logistics, and financing. It would be great to hear about how this is evolving and what exporters should be paying more attention to. David, would you like to start with this one?
Sure. So, I think going forward, it's going to be extremely important to be creative in terms of how do we unfold our trade relations between Canada and China. What I mean by that is, I think that a transactional relation, and that's been part of the discussions that we had, might not be sufficient enough to be able to expand trade. It will have to be integrated into services, into also potentially research and development partnerships. And if we look back many years ago, those partnerships are still discussed quite extensively in China in terms of how Canada contributed to, the beef, the pork domestic industry in terms of collaboration. I think right now we're in a different situation. I think it's going to be more of a situation of ensuring that our trade exports are really integrated into services that will allow more transparency along the supply chain, right? And if you look a few months ago, there was the Decree 280 that was announced by GACC, which is, I would tend to say, more a risk-based compliance system for ensuring supply chain transparency. So, that's going to be extremely important. And there's some discussions as well about potential digital product passports and all the multiple tools as well that will be part of that trading relation. So, I think it's going to be extremely important to look at how policies will be unfolding. And, we looked back 9 days ago, there was a new decree by the State Council, the 834, which, established systems to ensure the security of supply chains, right? And now we're talking about diversification and synergy between trading partners, but it's also going to be extremely important to see how those policies will be unfolding. And I think what is going to be important for Canadian exporters is invest time in terms of showing up, but also identify the key platforms for you to engage with, And I'm not talking necessarily about only stakeholders, but I'm talking also about, different expos. There was the Consumer Expo where Canada was the guest country of honor. There's going to be the Supply Chain Expo in June in Beijing, where there's going to be more details provided about, where our policies going in terms of supply chain. There's going to be the Seafood Expo as well in Shandong later this year. There's multiple platforms for you to really engage in and to meet with stakeholders, understand how the policies will be changing. Because what we see on the ground, and maybe my fellow panelists will be able to echo that, is that there's constant announcements on policies on different sectors. It takes a lot of time and energy to be able to follow them. So what is your best way? Well, number one, you need to have a certain presence in the market to stay on top of it, but you also need to constantly engage in discussions with stakeholders. And I think you have to have a broader perspective in terms of your engagement. You need to engage at the government level. You need to engage with stakeholders in your industry. But I think it's also important that you engage with, different stakeholders. Chris mentioned it. He's meeting with other embassies, other chambers of commerce, consulting firms. There's multiple people that can really provide you with valuable insights. And our job at CCBC is really also to help you look where to look for those insights and help you provide you a little bit more of perspectives also on what we've been observing in the market. And Canada has amazing products in terms of quality, and they're desired by Chinese consumers. And I think the fact that we were many of the stakeholders were there during tough times as well really helps to maintain those collaborations. But we cannot be complacent as well. I think the speed that will be required going forward will be even faster or more important than engagement that we noticed a few years ago. So I don't know if I answered the question, but I think that would be the perspectives that I would share.
Yeah, that was great. That was great. Thank you, David. There's been such a good conversation and discussion. In the essence of time, I'd just like to ask from all of you, if you could, this is going to be a hard one, in one sentence, looking ahead to the next 6 to 12 months, what should Canadian agri-food companies be doing to position themselves for success in China? In one sentence. Chris White.
I would say leverage the political capital that Prime Minister Carney used in January to engender some goodwill. He set the stage. Now we have to take advantage of it.
Great. Thank you. Chris Davidson.
Wow, that's a loaded question. But in one sense, I would say continue to demonstrate commitment to the market and to customers, that ongoing engagement. It's not stop start. It's got to be steady flow.
Right. Thank you. Cynthia.
Well, I think you need to approach China with vision and also continue to build institutional trust and to continue to stay business success.
Great. Thank you. And David.
I think it will regroup everyone's answer, but I think the key word is it's invest, not only capital, but invest time, invest in relationships, invest in following up what is happening. I think that's going to be extremely important and crucial in order to remain competitive in the market.
Thank you very much. So thanks to all of you for these very insightful and engaging discussion. We truly appreciate you sharing your perspectives from industry and from on the ground. Thank you for joining us today.